The road dust clung to Helen's sweat-soaked skin as the April sun beat down relentlessly on her uncovered head. It was the year 1879, and though she was only 32, the reflection in the puddles showed a woman who looked like she'd lived half a century. 8 months had passed since the quarry collapse swallowed her husband Frederick, leaving only a deafening emptiness that filled every corner of their home. That emptiness turned to terror on that Thursday morning, not with shouts or tears, but with the harsh sound of a door being locked for the very last time. Her brother-in-law, Sebastian, a man whose presence seemed to drain the light from any room, had decided that charity had well-defined limits. He stood on the doorstep, his eyes utterly devoid of compassion, as his henchman tossed Helen's last belongings into the red dust of the path. Helen had 6 children to feed, 6 small souls looking at her, waiting for answers she simply didn't possess. Peter, the eldest at 16, already carried the hardened gaze of one who had witnessed too much misery for his age. He held the cloth bundle containing the few iron pots that remained. Then came the middle ones, a staircase of frightened, emaciated faces, and finally, in her arms, little Rose, just 10 months old. Rose no longer cried. She only coughed, a wet, constant sound that pierced Helen's heart like a sharp dagger, reminding her every second that time was running out and that illness didn't negotiate deadlines. Sebastian's voice still echoed in her ears like a death sentence. "Charity is for the rich, Helen, and I can't afford that luxury," he had said with a coldness that froze even the warm afternoon air. The small farm plot that Frederick had cultivated with his own calloused hands, that land representing the family's entire inheritance, now belonged to the man who hadn't even shown up for his own brother's wake. Sebastian's men carried out the order in absolute silence, averting their eyes from Helen as they piled her entire life into an insignificant heap beside the rotting wooden fence. The broken bed, the blanket mended so many times that the original fabric was barely visible, the stone mortar, everything that represented years of honest work was now just junk dumped in the middle of nowhere. Helen clutched Rose to her chest, feeling the girl's feverish heat burning through the thin fabric of her dress, and gave the order to Peter with a voice that tried to hide her desperation. "Let's walk." There was no room for tears. Crying was a privilege reserved for those who still had a roof over their heads. They began to walk aimlessly, following the dusty trail that led away from the village. A silent procession of human misery. The afternoon sun scorched their exposed skin, and the bare feet of the younger children already showed burst, bleeding blisters. Vultures circled lazily high above, patient as ever. Knowing that human misfortune always left pickings for the scavengers, they had been on the road for 3 days. They spent the first night in the open, huddled together, trying to share body heat against the cutting cold of the pre-dawn arid backcountry, sharing the last handful of cassava flour Helen had managed to save at the bottom of her torn sack. Hunger was now a constant, sharp pain, a permanent cramp twisting in each of their stomachs. Peter tried to hunt small rodents and lizards, but his hands, though agile, were too weak from malnutrition. Helen knew with absolute certainty that they wouldn't survive another night exposed like that, especially Rose, whose breathing grew weaker and shallower, interrupted only by violent coughing that shook her fragile little body. It was then that Peter remembered the story he'd heard from the drovers, those legends whispered around campfires to scare unsuspecting travelers. They spoke of a place right at the end of the old road, where the dry earth turned into putrid mud and stagnant water, the old commercial house in the mangrove, a building said to have been erected in times of plenty when gold flowed from the mines, and which now lay rotting and abandoned, devoured by merciless humidity and complete oblivion. No one approached that cursed place. The villagers swore the old house was bewitched, that stolen money had contaminated the soil, and that the souls of dishonest merchants still counted gold coins in eternal darkness. Helen listened to Peter's detailed description of the cursed place. A roof over their heads, 4 sturdy walls. The curse didn't matter one bit. Ghosts and vengeful spirits couldn't be worse than the tearing hunger. Specters couldn't harm her daughter more than the high fever already consuming her from within. "Take me there," she ordered, her voice hoarse from the thirst that had tormented her for days. They walked for another 4 hours under the scorching sun, leaving behind the cracked, parched earth to enter a completely different world of ankle-deep thick mud and suffocating vegetation that blocked out the light. The air changed drastically, becoming dense and sticky, smelling of organic putrefaction, of pooled water full of mosquitoes, and of something more indefinable, something that smelled of rusted metal and stagnant time. They saw the frightening structure at dusk, a black and menacing silhouette cut against the orange sunset sky. The old house was much larger than Helen had imagined from the stories, an imposing 2-story structure made of noble woods, now completely warped and covered in a thick layer of dark green moss. It stood on thick hardwood pillars that sank deep into the black, foul-smelling mangrove water. The windows were empty, dark holes like skull orbits. A heavy silence enveloped the entire place, a silence so dense and oppressive that it seemed completely unnatural for an environment full of wildlife. Neither the noisy crickets nor the swamp frogs dared to sing near those cursed walls. Fear was something physical and palpable in the humid air, almost solid in her throat. Helen climbed the rotting steps of the main entrance, which creaked loudly under her meager weight, as if protesting the invasion. She pushed the heavy door that hung crooked from a single corroded and oxidized iron hinge. The interior was plunged into almost total darkness, flooded by the pungent smell of mold and rat urine. The floor was covered by a thick layer of dry mud and accumulated dead leaves, but at least it was dry in some corners. It was a shelter from the elements. "We'll spend the night here," Helen said, trying to infuse her voice with a confidence she was far from feeling. As she settled the trembling children in the least dirty corner she could find, on the broken remnants of an old noblewood counter, she felt something strange, a subtle vibration running through the floor. It wasn't the strong wind rattling the fragile structure. It wasn't the monotonous sound of water lapping against the pillars below. It came from below, from the damp earth floor that served as the foundation for the commercial house. A muffled, rhythmic sound, a persistent scratching that seemed to rise from the depths of the waterlogged earth. Helen froze completely, holding her breath, which burned in her lungs. She felt it more through the soles of her bare, calloused feet than through her ears, a movement like someone digging desperately. Terror paralyzed her completely, like an icy hand squeezing her heart. Alone, starving, with 6 children depending on her, in the only place everyone feared with dread, she just stood to discover that they were definitely not alone inside. The first night in that cursed old house was an inferno of heightened senses, a forced vigil by absolute terror. Helen sat the children against the driest wall she could find, far from the broken windows through which the cold breath of the mangrove seeped in, a vapor that stank of rotten mud and decaying flowers. She lit the only candle stub left at the bottom of the bag, a miserable flame of beef tallow that barely managed to pierce the immense hall's darkness, casting dancing shadows on the peeling walls that looked like swaying hanged men. The children didn't utter a single word. Fear had completely stolen their childlike voices. All that could be heard was the sharp, incessant buzz of hungry mosquitoes, a voracious army attacking them mercilessly, and Rose's broken, painful breathing, an agonizing wheeze that marked every interminable second of the night. The sound returned with redoubled force. Just as the candle began to drown in its own melted wax, the dull, heavy thud resonated again from beneath them. This time, Peter leaped to his feet in a single movement, grasping the rusty piece of iron pipe he had found abandoned on the path. He was 16 years old, but in that suffocating darkness, with his hair stuck to his forehead by the cold sweat of panic, he looked like a small man desperately trying to hold up a crumbling world. "Who's down there?" Peter shouted, his voice cracking in the heavy, humid air. The only response was the empty echo of his own question reverberating off the high ceiling's rotten beams. Helen placed a trembling hand on her son's tense shoulder. "Stay quiet, my son. Don't waste your energy." But the heavy silence that followed was infinitely worse than any noise. It was a silence full of expectation, as if the thing buried beneath the floor was listening intently, evaluating their every move. Helen sharpened her hearing to its maximum. It wasn't just any animal digging. She knew this with an absolute certainty that chilled her blood. The alligators of the mangrove, the otters, or the armadillos moved erratically and noisily with growls and splashes. This was completely different. It was a long, methodical scratching, followed by a dull, heavy thud, a calculated pause, and then it started again. Scratch, thump, like a desperate and tireless effort, a slow and patient work that had been going on long before they arrived. Terror materialized as a physical presence within the abandoned hall. It sat beside them, breathing heavily on their sweaty necks. Helen hugged her younger children tightly, feeling their thin bodies tremble violently, not from cold, but from a primal, instinctive fear. She herself felt her teeth chattering uncontrollably. What terrible thing had she done? Had she brought her innocent children to die in this God-forsaken hole? The legend of the cursed old house returned in full force to her tormented mind. They said the souls of cheating merchants suffered eternally, but disembodied souls didn't thump on wooden floors. Souls didn't dig earth. This was something alive, or something desperately fighting to stay alive. The entire night passed with Helen awake, sitting with her aching back against the worm-eaten wooden counter, feeling every minimal vibration from the floor through her spine. Each time the sinister sound returned from the depths, she clenched her jaw tightly, praying to a God who seemed to have completely forgotten this miserable corner of the world. Dawn arrived not as a liberating blessing, but as a gray and cruel revelation. The weak, grayish light filtering through the broken windows only served to show the true extent of the misery of the refuge they had found. Cracked, dry mud covering everything, spiderwebs thick as shrouds hanging from the ceiling, and the pale, sunken faces of her children who had dozed off from pure physical exhaustion. But the faint daylight brought with it an even more urgent and immediate terror. Little Rose was burning with a very high fever. The wet cough from the night before had turned into a deep and frightening death rattle, a gurgling sound that clearly indicated her tiny lungs were filling with fluid. Helen uncovered the girl's chest with trembling hands. Her skin was boiling to the touch, covered in a cold, viscous sweat. The girl no longer had the strength even to cry. Her half-closed eyes stared blankly. The panic that had been a constant companion throughout the night now exploded like a sharp scream inside Helen's head. The noise beneath the floor suddenly didn't matter anymore. The curse of the old house, the vengeful ghosts, none of it was a match for the real and tangible death she held in her trembling arms. She desperately needed help. She needed medicine she couldn't afford. But they were 3 long days' walk from the nearest village, without a penny to their name, with absolutely nothing to offer in return. "Peter, you need to find clean water," Helen said, her voice completely broken by the despair consuming her. "But not from the mangrove. There must be a well around here. Some usable water source." The brown mangrove water was thick and foul-smelling, reeking of death and decomposition. Giving that to Rose would be a certain death sentence. Peter nodded seriously, his young face hardened by a responsibility too heavy for his shoulders. He grabbed the only dented tin bucket they had and left the old house, looking with deep suspicion at the ground before stepping onto the rotten porch. Helen remained alone with the other friend children, mechanically cradling Rose, softly humming an old lullaby that caught in her throat, parched by thirst. It was while desperately searching for a cleaner place to lay the sick child, or perhaps just a dry corner where she could cry in peace away from the children's frightened eyes, that Helen began to explore the rest of the frightening old house. Beyond the cavernous main hall, there was a series of small, dark rooms, offices that had once been filled with ledger books and empty promises of easy wealth. Now, they were just empty, cold rooms with plaster falling in large chunks from the damp walls. It was in the back of the building, where the darkness was deepest, that she found something radically different from the rest. A thick, solid iron door attached to the rough stone wall hung crooked from a gigantic rusty hinge, the old vault. But it wasn't the heavy door that immediately captured her attention. It was the floor directly in front of it. Unlike the rest of the old house, covered by layers of dry mud and years of accumulated dead leaves, this specific section of the floor was covered with fresh, recently disturbed earth. And there was a small hole, no bigger than a man's closed fist, in the corner where the stone wall met the rotting wooden floorboards. The macabre sound was right there, directly beneath her, clearer and louder than ever, a human moan muffled by the compacted earth, followed by the frantic sound of someone scratching hard stone with their nails. And then a faint voice, barely more than a whisper of thin air. "Water, for God's sake." Helen instinctively recoiled, hitting hard against the counter behind her. The whisper had been as faint as a dying man's last breath, but as sharp and clear as a razor's edge. Water. It was a real human voice. Her mind, which had spent the entire night preparing to face specters and tormented souls from beyond, collapsed before a reality infinitely more terrifying than any or ghost. Down there, buried alive, was a person of flesh and blood. The terror of the supernatural instantly evaporated, replaced by the absolute horror of human cruelty taken to the extreme. Helen knelt on the hard ground, not caring about the dry mud or the scattered glass shards, and pressed her ear against the cold planks. The scratching returned, more frantic and desperate, and then the faint moan. "Peter!" Helen cried, her voice tearing through the oppressive silence of the mangrove. A scream of pure panic that echoed in the still water. "Peter, come back here now!" Peter ran back desperately, spilling more than half of the dirty water he had managed to scoop from an old rain puddle. Thinking his mother had been attacked by a venomous snake or that Rose's fever had made her completely delirious. "Mom, what is it?" he asked breathlessly. He found her on her knees, white as candle wax, pointing to the wooden floor next to the iron safe. "There's someone alive down there, alive and buried. I heard his voice." Peter looked at her with pure incredulity etched on his face, but then he also clearly felt it. The dull vibration rising through the floor, the rhythmic, heavy thud, was the sound that had terrified them all night. The ghost of the old mansion was not a disembodied spirit. It was a real prisoner. Without a second's hesitation, Peter used the rusty piece of pipe as a powerful lever. Helen joined him immediately, both digging frantically with their bare, bleeding hands, tearing away the hard, compacted earth and sharp splinters of rotten wood around the small hole. The work was desperate and frantic, driven by an explosive mix of terror and a strange, desperate hope. Each time they hit the wood hard, a faint, sharp moan responded from the depths below, guiding their efforts. The nauseating smell emanating from the hole intensified dramatically, a suffocating vapor of chronic illness, accumulated old urine, and slowly decaying human flesh that almost made them recoil in disgust. They finally managed to pry up one of the thick floorboards. It split in half with a dry, loud crack, opening a deep, black hole. The darkness below was absolute and suffocating, denser and more impenetrable than the night before. "The candle," Helen whispered urgently. Peter ran to get the candle stub and lit it with uncontrollably trembling hands. Helen took the weak flame, carefully cupped her hand around it, and slowly lowered it toward the dark hole. The yellow, flickering light bravely fought against the dense shadows, and for an agonizing instant they saw absolutely nothing but dirty water and black mud. And then the faint light illuminated a pair of deep-set eyes that reflected the glow of the flame. It was a man, or rather, what was left of a human being. He was submerged up to his waist in black, foul-smelling water that completely flooded the basement. His body was literally a walking skeleton covered in filthy rags and a crust of dirt. His long, completely matted hair fell over a face that was just prominent bone covered by stretched, grayish skin. But the worst of all was not his deplorable state. The worst was the heavy chain. A thick iron shackle was closed and locked around his swollen ankle, and the thick chain disappeared into the total darkness, firmly attached to the stone foundations of the safe. It hadn't been a tragic accident. It had been a slow, calculated death sentence. The man heavily lifted his head as he felt the comforting warmth of the candle. The movement was painfully slow and agonizing. He opened his parched mouth, but only a thin hiss of dry air came out. He raised a trembling hand, fingers twisted like vulture claws, toward the saving light. He wasn't asking to be freed from his chains. He was only asking for what he had whispered in desperation: clean water. It was a gesture that completely transcended madness. A basic biological need that had kept him agonizingly alive in that flooded hell. Helen felt vomit rise burning in her throat. This was the terrible secret of the cursed old mansion. This was the real curse the people spoke of with dread. How long had he been rotting alive there? Endless weeks? Torturous months? Judging by the wild growth of his hair and beard and the complete atrophy of his limbs, Helen knew, with a horror that froze her soul, that this man had been trapped there for entire years. Years surviving by eating raw rats and drinking the rotten mangrove water that seeped in, breathing the completely stale air of his own living tomb. He had been banging on the wooden floor, not for days or weeks, but for years on end, with the ever-fading hope that someone would finally hear his desperation. Helen looked over her aching shoulder at the dark corner where Rose coughed faintly. Her soaring fever, a flame competing with the candle, consumed her from within. She found herself cruelly caught between two inevitable deaths, that of her infant daughter, imminent and natural, and that of this unknown man, slow and manufactured by boundless human cruelty. She had come running to this cursed old mansion, fleeing a monster, Sebastian's icy indifference, only to find living evidence of a crime that defied all imagination. What to do now in this impossible situation? Cowardly ignore him and flee with her children, or help this human wreckage and risk whatever had put him down there? She couldn't simply abandon him to his fate. Her maternal instinct, so intensely focused on Rose, involuntarily expanded to include this suffering man. "Peter," Helen said, her voice firm, cutting through the heavy, stale air. "The bucket. Pass me the water now." Peter looked confused and conflicted. That murky, dirty water was for Rose, to try and bring down the fever that was killing her. "Give me the water," Helen ordered with authority. There was no precious time for long explanations. She took the old gourd cup they used for drinking and filled it with the muddy water, and with a surprisingly steady pulse that surprised her, she carefully lowered it through the dark hole. The man grabbed the gourd cup with a guttural animal grunt, spilling half of the precious liquid as he brought it to his cracked and bleeding lips. He drank with moving desperation, the water trickling down his matted, dirty beard. When he finished drinking it all, he let the gourd cup fall into the dirty water, and a violent tremor shook his entire skeletal body. He coughed hard, a dry, cavernous sound, as if his lungs were full of decades of accumulated dust. Then he looked up for the first time, his eyes finally focusing on Helen's face, illuminated from below by the weak candlelight. There was a brief second of true lucidity in that gaze before it was dominated by madness. He opened his mouth slowly, and this time the words came out clear, distinct, and absolutely terrible. A name that instantly froze Helen's blood in her already exhausted veins. Sebastian. It was Sebastian who did this. The name hit Helen with the devastating force of a lightning bolt from the sky. Sebastian. The completely stale air of the flooded basement seemed to solidify suddenly, making it impossible to breathe. Suddenly, all the unimaginable horror of her situation acquired a new and monstrous meaning that made her stagger. Her brother-in-law, the man who had mercilessly expelled her to the red dust of the road. Coldly citing charity as an unattainable luxury, was in fact a cold-blooded killer, an extremely patient executioner who had condemned another human being to slowly drown in his own accumulated misery for entire years. The cruel truth hit her like a punch to the stomach. Sebastian had deliberately sent her here. It was not blind chance. It wasn't cruel fate. He had manipulated her with her 6 starving children toward the only cursed place in the world that held his darkest secret, coldly assuming that the treacherous mangrove, the rampant disease, or the ghost he himself had created would finish the dirty work for him. The real curse of the old mansion was Sebastian himself. A violent coughing fit from little Rose broke the hypnotic trance. The girl's fragile body shook entirely in Helen's arms, the fever mercilessly consuming her from the inside out. Helen found herself cruelly trapped in a hell of 2 simultaneous fronts. Upstairs, her daughter was rapidly fading from illness, desperately needing clean, fresh water, expensive medicine, and human warmth. Downstairs, an innocent man was decomposing alive from inhumane cruelty, needing immediate freedom and belated justice. The skeletal man in the cellar was the living, breathing proof of Sebastian's heinous crime. Her baby daughter was the living proof of his murderous indifference. She looked at Peter, whose pale teenage face had brutally aged an entire decade in the last horrible minutes. "Mom," Peter whispered, his voice breaking, "it's Uncle Sebastian. He wanted us to die here too, didn't he?" Helen didn't need to answer with words. The man downstairs groaned again, a guttural animal sound of pure suffering. Benedict, the voice, ravaged by chronic thirst and imminent madness, managed to whisper, "My name is Benedict. I was the accountant. Helen sent Peter to fetch more water immediately, any water he could find, even from the foul-smelling mangrove. As the boy ran, Helen carefully lowered the candle again. Benedict spoke in disjointed, feverish fragments, his empty eyes fixed on the flickering small flame, as if it were the sun itself. He spoke brokenly about the embezzled gold, about the cowardly betrayal, about the false accounting books. He and Sebastian had embezzled from the commercial old mansion together in collusion, systematically stealing hard-earned money from deposits before declaring fraudulent bankruptcy. But Sebastian wanted everything for himself. "He locked me down here," Benedict hissed with concentrated hatred. "Said the mangrove would keep the secret forever. Years, whole years rotting." The urgency to get him out of there became a physical and pressing need. "Peter, we have to break this cursed chain now." They returned to the now much wider hole. Peter shoved the rusty iron pipe in and tried to powerfully pry the shackle that cruelly imprisoned Benedict's completely swollen and infected ankle. Helen pulled with all the strength of the desperation she possessed, but the chain was thick and resistant, anchored too deeply in the old mansion's solid stone foundations. It had been made specifically to resist, to absolutely ensure that Sebastian's terrible secret would die along with the chained man. Benedict, in a rare moment of lucidity that pierced the fog of madness, shook his head heavily from side to side. "The key is with him," he murmured bitterly. "In hell or in his pocket. It doesn't matter, it's the same thing now." Helen understood with painful clarity that they couldn't physically free him from the chains, and she also couldn't save Rose by standing there losing precious time. Time was running out fast for both, mother and daughter, prisoner and baby. She had to make a decision that literally tore her soul in half. But then she clearly saw the only possible way out, a narrow and extremely dangerous path that could save them all or definitively condemn them to death. She had to expose Sebastian publicly. She needed the outside world to know exactly what he had buried beneath the cursed old mansion. She looked at her eldest son, hunger deeply marking his protruding bones, but determination burning brightly in his deep-set eyes. "Peter," Helen said, her voice firm as solid rock, "you're going to have to run fast. You're going to have to go back to the village alone." Absolute terror crossed Peter's thin face. "No, Mom, I'm not leaving you here alone, with all this, and with him coming after us." She knew perfectly well what that meant in practice. 3 full days of forced walking, weak from constant hunger, through completely hostile and dangerous terrain. And if Sebastian found out somehow, if he intercepted him halfway, he wouldn't hesitate for a second to permanently silence a boy. "Rose will die if you don't go," Helen said, the raw, naked truth like an open, bleeding wound. "This man will die down here, and Sebastian will win everything. We will die here exactly as he planned from the beginning." She took out the old torn bag and pulled out the last corn biscuit, hard as shoe leather. "Take this and the gourd cup. Don't go by the main path where they might see you. Follow the edge of the mangrove. Find the justice of the peace, Dr. Alastair. Tell him absolutely everything." Peter clenched his jaw tightly, swallowing the fear that threatened to paralyze him, and nodded firmly. He hugged his mother with all the strength left in his thin arms for a few precious seconds, and, without looking back once, disappeared running among the gray mangroves of the dawning day. Helen was left completely alone with 5 terrified small children, a dying daughter in her arms, and a chained man beneath the wooden floor who represented her sole and terrible evidence of the crime. The abandoned and cursed old mansion, which had initially been a terrifying refuge against the elements, had now transformed into something infinitely worse, a death trap, a fragile fortress she needed to defend tooth and nail. Her task now was not just to survive a few more hours, it was to keep Benedict alive at all costs. He was the living witness. Without him breathing, it was just the worthless word of a crazy, miserable widow against a powerful and respected man. She spent the rest of that endless day in a feverish, exhausted haze, dividing her scarce attention between her two critical patients. She completely tore strips from her own skirt, the only minimally clean piece of fabric she still possessed. With a rag wet with the murky mangrove water, she carefully wiped the burning, sticky sweat from Rose's feverish forehead, praying intensely that the temporary coolness would bring down the deadly fever. With another dirty piece of cloth, she tried to clean Benedict's grimy face and skeletal arms, reaching down with difficulty through the dark hole, trying to remove at least part of the thick crust of accumulated dirt and disease that covered him entirely. The nauseating stench was absolutely unbearable, but she held her breath tightly and continued the work. She prepared the last bit of cassava flour she had saved, mixing it with the dirty water until it formed a watery, tasteless gruel. Half of it went to her starving children, who drank eagerly as if it were a feast. The other half she carefully lowered in the old gourd cup for Benedict down below. He drank like a wild, starving animal, with low, guttural grunts, spilling a considerable portion over his sunken, wound-covered chest. It was a grotesque and disturbing communion. The miserable widow and the forgotten prisoner sharing absolute misery as they waited anxiously, one for delayed justice and the other for death or salvation. The afternoon dragged on endlessly, the heavy mangrove air growing thick and orange with the sunset. Rose could barely breathe now, each inhalation a heroic effort. And Benedict had fallen into a delirious and worrying silence. Helen sat down, exhausted, beside the dark hole, the pipe and Peter's rusty pipe resting heavily on her lap. She listened intently to every sound of nature around her. Every abrupt movement in the still water, every sharp squawk of a bird made her jump in fright. She waited anxiously for Matthew. She waited desperately for the justice of the peace. Then she finally heard the sound she most feared in her heart, the heavy, determined gallop of several horses approaching. It was too early for it to be a good thing. Peter couldn't have returned so quickly, not even if he had flown like a bird. Panic clenched her dry throat like an iron fist. She knew exactly who it was before she even saw them. She rose, stumbling, grabbed Rose firmly with one trembling arm, and wielded the iron pipe with the other. She positioned herself firmly in the rotten main doorway. Just as Sebastian emerged into the muddy clearing, flanked by 3 of his armed henchmen, he stared at her fixedly, his face showing no surprise, only a cold and completely calculated fury. "I see clearly," Sebastian said, dismounting from his horse with studied calm, methodically wiping the dust from his expensive boots, "that you found my old buried partner." Sebastian's voice was soft and almost gentle on the surface, but the deadly venom in his chosen words was thicker and more dangerous than the black mud of the mangrove. He carefully wiped the red dust from his fine leather boots on the rotten step, as if he were the rightful owner of the place, and indeed he was. He was the absolute owner of that heinous crime, the meticulous architect of that living tomb. His 3 trusted men, with hard faces marked by violence and eyes completely devoid of any humanity, stood on the narrow porch, strategically blocking the only possible exit. Helen took an instinctive step back, squeezing Rose with such desperate force that the girl let out a weak whimper of pain. The rusty pipe in her other hand felt ridiculously insignificant, a pathetic toy compared to the loaded shotguns Sebastian's men casually carried on their broad shoulders. "I wasn't expecting visitors, brother-in-law." Helen said, her voice visibly trembling, despite all superhuman effort to sound firm and courageous. Sebastian smiled broadly, a horrible grimace that didn't remotely reach his dead, cold eyes. "And I honestly didn't expect you to be so stubborn and hard to kill. I should have imagined my brother's family was tough to die." He walked through the main hall as if inspecting a property, his penetrating gaze coldly sweeping from Helen's terrified children huddled in the darkest corner to Rose's obvious and deadly fever, and finally to the irregular hole in the wooden floor, the epicenter of everything. "I sent you here hoping the mangrove would swallow you, Helen. The fever, the hunger, or even the ghost of my partner, whom I see you've already met personally. It was even a poetic ending to your story, but you always have to complicate everything, don't you?" The confession was so open and brazen, so devoid of any remorse, that Helen felt a violent chill that had absolutely nothing to do with the icy humidity of the mangrove. Benedict was always too ambitious for his own good, Sebastian continued with a false theatrical nostalgia, as if casually commenting on the weather. "We embezzled from the commercial house together for years. It was a perfect and lucrative scheme, but he got too greedy. He wanted to renegotiate the division. He wanted to threaten me with public exposure." He stopped strategically beside the dark hole and looked with contempt into the deep darkness below. But he never understood the most basic lesson, that true wealth and power isn't accumulated gold, it's absolute control over people. And he completely lost control of the situation. From below, upon clearly recognizing the voice that had condemned him to living hell, Benedict began to scream desperately. They weren't articulate words, it was an animal howl of pure fury and accumulated madness, the disturbing sound of a soul already dead trying to return to its shattered body while banging its heavy chains against the foundation stone with all its remaining strength. Sebastian didn't even flinch at the noise. Always too loud, annoying to the end. Paralyzing horror quickly gave way to incandescent fury within Helen. She moved instinctively, placing herself between Sebastian and the hole that led to Benedict. "You left him here to rot alive like an animal. You abandoned him in the darkness, just as you abandon us on the road to die. You are worse than a monster. You are the devil himself." Sebastian let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Monster, devil, I'm just an intelligent businessman, Helen. And now, my current business requires me to definitively clean up this whole mess you created." He turned coldly to his men standing at the entrance. "Burn this cursed place now. The wood is rotten and dry. It will catch fire quickly and easily. And make sure the fire reaches the basement below, too. I want everything to cook thoroughly." His icy words sealed the fate of all present without possibility of appeal. There was no room for negotiation or pity, only brutal survival. One of the henchmen smiled maliciously and pulled a large metal flask from his saddlebag. Flammable kerosene. He immediately began to spray the dark, foul-smelling liquid on the wooden porch, the pungent, toxic smell inundating the heavy air, stronger even than the permanent mold. The second man carefully prepared an improvised torch soaked in cloth. The younger children began to cry loudly, perfectly understanding the terrible meaning of those acts. Helen knew with absolute certainty that she had only a few precious seconds to act. Fire was the perfect and clean solution for Sebastian. It would completely destroy the old mansion, all physical evidence, chained Benedict, and the inconvenient witnesses, she and her innocent children, in a single giant funeral pyre that would look like just a tragic accident. As the henchman dangerously approached with the already lit and crackling torch, Sebastian seemed to remember something important that bothered him. The annoying noise from below was disturbing his perfect control of the situation. Benedict's angry scream was an unacceptable affront to his absolute authority. "Wait a moment," he ordered the torchbearer. He unslung the expensive shotgun from his own shoulder and walked determinedly towards Helen. His intention was crystal clear and terrifying. He wasn't going to wait patiently for the fire to do its slow work. He was going to empty his weapon directly into the dark hole, personally ensuring that Benedict, his only partner in crime, who knew all the details, was definitively dead before the dancing flames reached him. "This noisy ghost needs to go back to the hell from which he should never have left," Sebastian murmured coldly, pointing the long barrel of the shotgun directly into the deep darkness beneath Helen's bare feet. The polished metal gleamed sinisterly in the orange light of the inexorably approaching torch, but Helen, who had already irreparably lost her home, her beloved husband, and almost her baby daughter, found a last unsuspected reserve of courage and strength. It wasn't for herself, it was for Peter running desperately somewhere distant in the mangrove. It was for Benedict, the crucial witness who absolutely could not die now. It was for true justice, a beautiful word she had almost completely forgotten existed. The precise instant Sebastian prepared his finger on the trigger to fire, she acted out of pure maternal instinct, dropped the heavy iron pipe to the ground, and with Rose still clinging firmly against her chest, she threw herself violently over the open hole. She completely covered the irregular opening with her own lean body, transforming herself into a fragile human shield over Benedict's living tomb. Sebastian's deadly shotgun barrel now pointed directly at her unprotected, bowed back. She raised her head defiantly, her dirty, tangled hair plastered to her sweaty face, and stared at him with a courage that caught him completely off guard. "No!" Helen cried, her powerful voice tearing through the heavy, stale air. "If you're going to kill him, you'll have to kill us all first. You'll have to shoot me in the back, you miserable coward!" The entire world seemed to freeze in that instant. The man holding the lit torch stood paralyzed. The terrified children stopped crying, choked by the awe of their mother's impossible bravery. Sebastian stared fixedly at her, his face contorting into an uncontrollable fury that far surpassed his initial disbelief. He expected abundant tears, desperate pleas, the complete humiliation of a terrified widow begging for her life. He never expected this open defiance, never expected such a dramatic voluntary sacrifice. His finger trembled visibly on the sensitive trigger. The worn, thin fabric of Helen's dress was stretched tautly over her lean back, a perfectly easy target just a few feet away. Down in the dark hole, Benedict, finally understanding what was happening above him, fell into a sudden and complete silence, a heavy silence of imminent death. Precisely at that unbearable second of maximum tension, as Sebastian's finger slowly began to squeeze the fatal trigger, a completely unexpected sound violently cut through the still air of the mangrove. It wasn't a splash of water, it wasn't a human cry, it was an organized and purposeful sound. It was the unmistakable sound of multiple horses galloping with great urgency, rapidly approaching along the same muddy path Sebastian had taken hours earlier. Helen closed her eyes tightly, praying fervently that it was Peter returning victorious. Sebastian spun around abruptly, his face instantly shifting from murderous rage to uncontrolled panic. He absolutely did not expect more visitors in that forgotten place. Justice, slow and heavy like the very mud of the mangrove, was finally arriving to settle accounts. The deafening gallop quickly transformed into a thunder of pounding hooves and loud shouts of men. From the dense mangrove emerged not 2 or 3, but 8 determined riders, forcing their way through the thick vegetation with an urgency that left no room for doubt about their intentions. At the front rode a corpulent and imposing man wearing the distinctive wide-brimmed hat of a justice of the peace, and clinging tightly to his right side, gripping the sweaty mane of a panting horse, came Peter, visibly exhausted. The courageous boy had achieved the absolutely impossible. He had crossed the treacherous mangrove in record time, driven solely by terror and unconditional love, and had finally brought the law to a place the law had completely abandoned years ago. The wonderful sight of her son alive and breathing, accompanied by the official authority, was like a life-saving gasp of fresh air to Helen's completely suffocated lungs. It had worked perfectly against all odds. The careful mask of sadistic control on Sebastian's face shattered into 1,000 pieces, replaced by a sickly pallor that quickly morphed into visible panic. His 3 henchmen, the one with the lit torch and the other 2 with shotguns, froze completely in place. They had been generously hired to intimidate a defenseless widow and her hungry children, not to face 8 heavily armed men who directly represented the government and the law in battle. The delicate balance of power in the muddy clearing of the mangrove completely inverted in a single miraculous second, as fast as lightning tearing through the sky. The justice of the peace, Dr. Alastair, dismounted with impressive agility, his expensive pistol already firm in his experienced hand, his penetrating and intelligent gaze methodically sweeping the entire disturbing scene. He quickly saw the terrified small children, the woman fallen on the dirty ground, desperately protecting a mysterious hole, the powerful man holding a shotgun, and the extremely strong and unmistakable smell of flammable kerosene permeating everything. "In the name of law and order, Sebastian," thundered the judge's deep, authoritative voice, a voice naturally accustomed to commanding and being obeyed without question. Sebastian immediately lowered the heavy shotgun, desperately trying to recompose his public facade as a respectable and honorable man of society. He raised his trembling hands in a studied gesture of peace and innocence. "Dr. Alastair, thank heavens you arrived in time. This poor, unfortunate woman has completely lost her mind. The terrible mangrove fever. She's dangerously delirious, talking endlessly about ghosts and conspiracies. I found her here almost harming her own innocent children. This whole place is a death trap about to collapse. We were going to burn it for pure public safety, you understand?" The lie tumbled so quickly from his mouth, so incredibly smooth and convincing, that for a brief moment it almost seemed perfectly plausible and true. But Helen wouldn't allow that to happen, not in any way. Still prostrate on the filthy ground, protecting the dark hole with her fragile body, she raised her head with difficulty. Her voice wasn't a hysterical scream. It was a whisper laden with concentrated venom and absolute truth that cut the air like a sharp blade. "He lies shamelessly," Helen hissed with hatred. "He lies as naturally as he breathes. This man here is a cruel and calculating murderer. There's no ghost haunting this place. He has a living man chained in the flooded basement, a man named Benedict, his former partner, whom he's been slowly starving for years." The monstrous accusation was so absurd and unbelievable, so completely out of any normalcy, that Judge Alastair stood still and motionless, his grave gaze quickly moving from the powerful and wealthy Sebastian, recognized owner of the productive half of the valley, to the miserable, dirty widow who reeked of sickness and rotting mangrove. The judge frowned deeply. It was the worthless word of a wealthy and respected farmer against the desperate accusation of a beggar woman. It was a scenario all too painfully familiar. "Helen, this is an extremely serious and baseless accusation," the skeptical judge began, but couldn't finish the sentence. From beneath the wooden floor, upon clearly hearing the new and different voices, fueling a desperate hope of finally getting a fair hearing, Benedict used his last remaining strength. He began to rhythmically beat his heavy iron chain against the hard stone wall of the foundations. Clang, clang, clang. A loud and unmistakable metallic sound, rhythmic and desperate. A sound that definitely could not be mistaken for an imaginary ghost or an old house settling. The real ghost of the cursed old mansion was desperately asking to be heard, demanding to be listened to. Sebastian's face instantly turned the exact color of cold ash. "It's just the old structure settling, rotten wood creaking," he shouted, his voice rising an entire octave, completely tinged with poorly disguised panic, "about to collapse on our heads." But Judge Alastair no longer looked at him with any shred of trust. He stared fixedly at the irregular hole in the floor with horror, a growing, genuine expression on his face. He made a firm signal to 3 of his men. "Bring the strong lanterns now. Break up this floor completely." Sebastian's henchmen didn't make a single move to try and stop the action. The deep fear of the law and its consequences was infinitely stronger than any loyalty bought with dirty money. Helen moved away, dragging her body, pulling herself to where Rose lay, while the judge's men used sharp axes and thick iron crowbars to violently tear up the remaining rotten floorboards. The hole widened dramatically, fully revealing the absolute and suffocating darkness below. 3 oil lanterns were carefully lowered, and their strong orange light finally illuminated Benedict's personal and private hell. The experienced men let out loud exclamations of horror and disgust. Judge Alastair approached and leaned over the edge, then recoiled violently, his face visibly paling. He saw with his own eyes the beast man chained like an animal, the fetid, dark water up to his waist, stripped bones of dead rats floating on the surface, the scene's complete and utter inhumanity. "Almighty and merciful God," the judge murmured, respectfully taking off his hat, not out of ceremonial respect, but out of pure shock and horror. He stared directly at Sebastian, no longer with any doubt in his voice, but with total and visceral repulsion. "Sebastian, what horrible abomination have you committed here?" Sebastian instantly knew he was irremediably lost. The absolute control he had painstakingly maintained for years shattered into 1,000 pieces. His eyes darted frantically, desperately searching for an impossible escape, a final saving lie. But there simply wasn't one that would work. He tried to run like a coward, turning abruptly and lunging towards his waiting horse, but the judge's armed men were infinitely faster and more efficient. They brought him down brutally in the black mud before he could even touch the leather saddle. He fought fiercely like a trapped wild animal, screaming horrible curses, but they easily subdued him, tying his hands tightly behind his back with a thick, rough rope. The social mask of the respectable, wealthy farmer had completely fallen, finally revealing the cruel monster that had always existed beneath. Sebastian's 3 henchmen, his direct accomplices in the crime, surrendered instantly without offering any resistance. They threw the kerosene flask and the lit torch onto the wet ground, raising their hands, their faces suddenly marked by the genuine terror of being considered active accomplices in such a horrific and unforgivable atrocity. Judge Alastair ordered them to be tied up immediately as well, and amidst the organized chaos of the swift arrests, Helen finally allowed herself to sit on the dirty, cold floor of the old mansion. The pure adrenaline that had kept her standing and fighting, that had transformed her into a fearless human shield, completely drained from her body all at once, leaving her empty and trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Rose still in her arms, her breath as weak and shallow as water in a saucer. She had won the impossible battle. She had publicly unmasked the monster, but her baby daughter was still slowly dying in her arms. Judge Alistair, Dr. Alistair, as he was respectfully called, put away his expensive pistol and took complete command of the chaotic scene with a natural authority that instantly crushed any confusion. As his trained men firmly apprehended Sebastian and his trembling henchmen, who now knew perfectly well that the detailed testimony of a crime of such monstrous magnitude would lead them directly to the public gallows, Helen felt all the superhuman strength that had sustained her until then finally dissolve like smoke. The adrenaline completely evaporated from her exhausted body, leaving only the unbearable and crushing weight of cruel reality. Rose continued to die inexorably. She collapsed right there on the dirty porch floor, holding the little girl whose tiny chest barely moved. Dr. Alistair saw her clearly, his face, naturally hardened by years of witnessing the horrors of human nature, visibly softened with genuine concern. "That demon is well tied, madam," he said firmly but gently. "But for heaven's sake, what is wrong with this little child?" Helen could only lift her tired gaze, her eyes completely dry from days of accumulated fear. "High fever. She's dying, doctor. Dying, just like that man down there." The urgency of the situation drastically shifted from the pursuit of justice to a desperate race against time to save lives. Dr. Alistair looked again into the dark, fetid hole from which an absolutely unbearable stench emanated, enough to turn even the strongest stomach. The crime scene remained vivid and pulsating. "Immediately bring the iron bars from the mounts," he ordered his men, "and the large axes. We need to get this poor man out of there before this rotten water definitively kills him." 3 of his strongest men, visibly pale but determined to fulfill their duty, carefully descended into the flooded hell using ropes. The level of the fetid, dark water reached their waists. The strong light from their lanterns illuminated the walls, completely covered by a thick layer of green and black slime. And the heavy anchor of the chain, as thick as an arm and completely rusted, absolutely impossible to break free from the solid stone. They had to directly and violently attack the iron shackle itself that cruelly imprisoned Benedict's swollen, purple, and infected ankle. Before we continue, I want to take a quick break from the story. If you're following this incredible narrative and feeling the tension of every moment, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. This community grows because people like you share these powerful stories. And tell me in the comments, would you have had the same courage that Helen had? Would you have thrown yourself in front of danger to protect a stranger? Your answer can inspire others here in our family. Now, let's go back to find out what happens to Benedict and little Rose. As the dull, heavy blows of metal against metal echoed menacingly from the depths of the flooded cellar, the judge carefully knelt beside Helen on the dirty floor. He was an experienced man, hardened by life, and also a family man, and he immediately recognized the glazed, distant gaze of approaching death in little Rose's half-closed eyes. He delicately touched her burning forehead. It was burning hot. "This girl urgently needs quinine and a real doctor, not prayers and empty promises," he said with necessary bluntness, but without any cruelty in his voice. He looked directly at Peter, who was visibly trembling from pure accumulated physical exhaustion. "Brave boy, you guided us halfway perfectly. Do you still have strength left for the other half?" Before Peter could even gather the strength to respond affirmatively, Dr. Alistair made a swift executive decision. He called his most trusted man with a whistle. "Take my horse, the sorrel. It's by far the fastest of all. Fly to the village without stopping. Don't just walk, truly fly. Bring Dr. Henry immediately. Tell him there are 2 precious lives at stake here, and that if he delays too long, Sebastian won't be the only killer in this cursed mangrove today." Down in the deep hole, the metallic, repetitive sound of the blows finally ceased suddenly, followed by a sharp, liberating crack and Benedict's completely muffled, guttural cry. "He's finally free!" one of the drenched men below shouted victoriously, his voice echoing off the damp walls. They began the extremely difficult task of lifting Benedict's completely debilitated body out of that liquid tomb. It was no simple task. The man was so weak and malnourished that he seemed to be made only of fragile bones covered by a thin layer of stretched skin. His muscles had completely atrophied from disuse during interminable years in chains. When they finally pulled him up, carefully laying him on the floor of the old mansion, the full light of day revealed the entire extent of the horror. Benedict was a living, walking skeleton, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets, his skin stained with open wounds and infections, his body covered by a thick crust of dried excrement and hardened mud. The stench emanating from him was so strong and penetrating that several experienced men recoiled, covering their noses and mouths. But he was alive, breathing with extreme difficulty. His empty eyes searched frantically until they found Helen amidst the confusion. You saved me," Benedict managed to whisper with a ruined voice, each word a Herculean effort. "You saved me when no one else would come." Dirty tears began to trickle slowly down the deep furrows of his skeletal face. They were not tears of accumulated sorrow. They were of a relief so profound and overwhelming that it completely transcended human words. Helen, still holding a feverish rose, simply nodded silently. There were no adequate words for that surreal moment. Judge Alastair ordered clean, fresh water and warm blankets to be brought immediately, everything they could find on their mounts. He sent 2 men to tend to Benedict with extreme delicacy, cleaning him with wet cloths, giving him small sips of pure water so as not to overwhelm his devastated system. Sebastian, bound and forcibly kneeling in the dark mud a few feet away, watched everything in absolute silence. His expression had shifted from uncontrolled fury to something far worse, a complete emptiness. The emptiness of a man who knows with absolute certainty that his world has definitively ended. There was no more mask to wear, no more lies that would work. His wickedness had been laid bare in the merciless light of day. The judge approached him slowly, looking at him with a complex mixture of repulsion and morbid curiosity. "How many years, Sebastian?" he asked coldly. "How many years did you keep this innocent man down there, rotting alive?" Sebastian didn't answer initially. He merely stared at the muddy ground. But then, perhaps realizing that silence would change nothing of his inevitable fate, he murmured softly, 5 full years, maybe 6. I lost exact count a long time ago." The casual confession, uttered with terrifying indifference, made even the most hardened men present recoil in horror. 6 whole years. 6 years of continuous torture, of absolute despair, of darkness and hunger and solitude. Judge Alastair closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to control the rage that threatened to explode. "You will pay for every day, every hour that this man suffered," he said with a low voice, yet heavy with a deadly promise. "You will answer before God and before men." The afternoon was advancing rapidly, and with it, desperate anxiety grew. The doctor needed to arrive soon. Rose was growing weaker, her breathing so shallow that Helen had to bring her ear close to the tiny mouth to confirm she was still breathing. Peter stayed by his mother's side, holding her free hand tightly, both praying in silence. Benedict, now wrapped in rough blankets and receiving basic care, was slowly regaining fragments of lucidity. He began to speak haltingly, telling his complete story to the judge, who meticulously wrote everything down in a leather notebook. He spoke about the criminal partnership with Sebastian, about how they diverted fortunes from honest merchants who trusted the commercial house. He spoke about the final quarrel, when he demanded a larger share, and Sebastian simply invited him to sort things out in the cellar. "He hit me from behind with an iron bar," Benedict recounted, touching the back of his neck where a deep scar still marked the spot. "I woke up chained in the icy water. I thought I would die that first night, but something inside me refused to give up." He described the first horrible days, screaming until his voice completely failed, hoping someone, anyone, would pass close enough to hear. He described how he learned to hunt rats with his bare hands in total darkness, how he drank the dirty water that seeped in, how he scratched marks on the stone walls so as not to completely lose track of time. "After a few months, maybe a year, I lost count of the days," he continued, his voice breaking. "I started banging on the floor whenever I heard something upstairs, birds, wind, anything, just to remember I was still alive, that I still had a voice, even if I couldn't speak." The account was so disturbing, so beyond any normal comprehension of human suffering, that a heavy silence fell upon everyone present. Even Sebastian's captured henchmen, who surely had their own dark stories, seemed shocked and pale. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple when they finally heard the saving sound. Horses approaching rapidly, this time only 2. The messenger had returned, and with him came an older man carrying a worn leather satchel. Dr. Henry, the only physician for many miles around. He dismounted with surprising agility for his age, quickly assessed the chaotic scene with experienced eyes that had seen everything, and went straight to the essentials. "Where are the critical patients?" he asked, without unnecessary preambles. The judge pointed first to Rose in Helen's trembling arms. The doctor knelt, opened his satchel, and began a quick but thorough examination. He listened to the girl's chest with a stethoscope, examined her eyes, touched her burning skin. His face remained professional, but Helen saw genuine concern cross his tired eyes. "Advanced pneumonia," he gravely diagnosed. "We need to bring this fever down immediately and drain the fluid from her lungs. I can't guarantee anything, but I will do everything within my power." He quickly prepared a dose of quinine dissolved in clean water, managing to make Rose swallow it slowly. He applied cold compresses, administered an expectorant syrup. He worked with an efficiency that came from decades of practice. Then he turned his attention to Benedict. The examination was more prolonged. He checked every infected wound, every prominent bone, assessed the state of extreme malnutrition. "This man should be dead," he finally told the judge in a low voice, which Helen could still hear. "The fact that he's alive it's simply medically impossible. His will to survive transcends any scientific explanation I know." He began treating the most severe infections, cleaning wounds with alcohol that made Benedict groan in pain, bandaging, administering medication. "He will need weeks, perhaps months of constant care," he explained to the judge, "but I believe he will survive. After enduring 6 years in that hell, I'm sure he can endure anything." Night fell completely over the mangrove. Judge Alastair did not want to risk moving the critical patients in the darkness along the treacherous paths. He ordered an improvised camp to be set up right there, with large bonfires to ward off mosquitoes and nocturnal animals. His men worked efficiently, clearing an area of the old mansion, bringing provisions from their mounts, keeping watch over the bound prisoners. Helen could finally rest for the first time in days. Peter and the other children received real food, fresh bread and jerky, which they devoured as if they had never seen food before. Dr. Henry continued monitoring Rose throughout the night, applying new doses of medicine every hour, changing her compresses. Around midnight, the fever finally began to subside. Rose opened her little eyes for the first time in days, vaguely focusing on her mother's face. "Mama," she whispered so softly that Helen barely heard. It was the most beautiful word she had ever heard in her life. Tears finally rolled down Helen's face, tears of pure, overwhelming relief and gratitude. She hugged her daughter with extreme care, feeling the little body that no longer burned so fiercely with fever. "It's all right, my love," she murmured, kissing her damp forehead. "It's all right now. It's over. Mama protected you. Mama protected all of us." On the other side of the fire, Benedict also rested, wrapped in clean blankets, his stomach finally full of real food, albeit in small amounts he could tolerate. He stared fixedly at the starry sky above, something he hadn't seen in years. Silent tears continued to stream down his skeletal face. He couldn't stop crying, releasing years of pent-up suffering. Peter sat beside Benedict, not too close to invade his space, but close enough to keep him company. "You are very strong, sir," the boy said with genuine admiration in his voice. "Stronger than anyone I know." Benedict slowly turned his head, looking at the boy. "It's not strength, boy," he replied, his voice still hoarse. "It was pure stubbornness. I refused to give him the satisfaction of killing me. I refused to let him win completely." He explained that he had created routines to maintain sanity in total darkness. He would count to 1,000 and start over, just to keep his mind working. He mentally recited all the books he had read in childhood. He planned in meticulous detail what he would do if he ever got out alive. Every step, every denunciation. "And now I will do all of that," he said with a renewed determination shining in his deep-set eyes. "I will testify. I will tell every detail. I will ensure he pays for every second he stole from me." Judge Alastair joined the conversation, sitting near the fire. "Your testimony is crucial, Mr. Benedict," he confirmed, "but I want you to know that even without you, the physical evidence is irrefutable. The shackle on your ankle, the marks on the basement walls, the state of the place, all of it tells the story. Sebastian will pay. I personally guarantee it." Sebastian, tied to a nearby tree under constant vigilance, listened to everything in silence. His empire of lies had collapsed in a matter of hours, all because of a stubborn widow who refused to simply die quietly as he had planned. He looked at Helen for the dancing flames of the bonfire. She felt the weight of his gaze and returned it, staring directly back without any fear. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The message was clear in her eyes. You lost, monster. Dawn arrived, bringing a golden, clean light that seemed to wash the mangrove of all its putrefaction. Rose was visibly better, able to sit up with help and even drink a warm broth the doctor prepared. Benedict also showed impressive improvements, human resilience in full display. The judge organized the return to the village. They built an improvised stretcher for Benedict and another for Rose, not wanting to risk overexertion. Helen would ride with Peter, the other children divided among the judge's men's horses. Sebastian and his henchmen would walk, bound and escorted, a preview of the public humiliation that awaited them. Before leaving, the judge made sure to meticulously document everything. He personally descended into the fetid basement with a flashlight, accompanied by 2 witnesses, and noted every detail. The scratch marks on the stone walls where Benedict had tried to count the days, the broken shackle still attached to the chain, the scattered rat bones, the level of the dirty water. Everything would be presented as evidence in the upcoming trial. He also briefly interrogated each of the henchmen separately. 2 of them swore they knew nothing about the prisoner in the basement, that they merely followed orders to burn the old mansion without questioning. But the third, perhaps seeking some clemency, confessed he knew of rumors that Sebastian had once commented while drunk about a very real ghost guarding his secrets. This additional testimony would be valuable. The procession back to the village was slow, but triumphant in a sense. Word had spread quickly. The judge's messengers had alerted the settlement about the horrible discovery. When they finally arrived at the main square in the late afternoon, an entire crowd was already waiting for them. The horror and indignation were palpable in the air. People who knew Sebastian, who did business with him, who respected him, now looked at him with absolute repulsion and disgust. Some spat on the ground as he passed. Others shouted insults. "Monster! Murderer! May he rot in hell!" Sebastian kept his head down, completely defeated. Helen was received in a completely opposite manner. People she barely knew approached to offer help, food, a place to stay. The story of her courage, how she had thrown herself in front of death to protect a stranger, how she had sent her son on an impossible journey to seek justice, had deeply touched everyone's hearts. An elderly and kind lady, Mrs. Margaret, offered her own home to Helen and the children. "Stay as long as you need, dear," she said with tears in her wrinkled eyes. "You and your children will always have a roof with me. What you did was heroic, pure heroism." Dr. Henry settled Rose and Benedict in his own clinic, determined to personally continue both their treatments. Rose improved quickly with proper care, but Benedict would still need many weeks to minimally recover. Sebastian's trial was swift, considering the standards of the time. The evidence was so overwhelming, the crime so heinous, that no defense was possible. His own lawyer seemed embarrassed trying to argue. Benedict testified, still weak, but with a voice that grew in firmness with each word. He told his complete story before the crowded court. He described every moment of suffering, every day of despair, every time he thought of giving up but decided to continue. The silence in the room was absolute. Many people cried openly. Helen also testified, describing how she had been expelled, how she found the old mansion, how she discovered Benedict. She described the moment Sebastian arrived, intending to burn everyone alive, how she protected the whole with her own body. "I did what any mother would do," she said simply. "I protected those who couldn't protect themselves. My children and that innocent man were equal in that moment. They all needed me." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty of attempted murder, kidnapping, torture, fraud, and an extensive list of other crimes. The sentence was death by hanging. Sebastian heard the verdict without visible reaction, as if he already knew this would be his fate. He was taken to the local prison to await the execution of the sentence. In the months that followed, Helen's life changed drastically. The story had spread throughout the region and beyond. Newspapers from distant cities published articles about the courageous widow of the mangrove and the forgotten prisoner. Donations began to arrive from people touched by the story. Enough money for Helen to buy a small piece of land and start anew. The property Sebastian had stolen from her was returned by court order, along with generous compensation for the suffering caused. Benedict also recovered slowly. He gained weight, his wounds healed, his mind began to process the immense trauma. He developed a deep friendship with Helen and her children, especially with Peter. "You gave me hope when I had none," he once told Helen while they had coffee on the porch of her new house. In the darkness, when I was about to give up, something told me someone would come, and you did. You and your children were my literal salvation, Helen smiled, a tired but genuine smile. And you were ours, in a way. If it weren't for you, for your courage to survive, we would never have been able to prove what Sebastian truly was. We saved each other. Benedict decided to use the money recovered from the fraudulent scheme, which the judge ordered to be returned to the victims and those who helped expose the crime, to help other widows and orphans in the region. He established a charity fund, something good emerging from all that evil. Rose grew up healthy and strong, with no real memories of those terrible days, but carrying the story as part of her identity. Peter became a respected young man, known for his courage and loyalty. He often told the story to the younger ones in the village, always emphasizing the importance of never giving up, of fighting for what is right, even when it seems impossible. The old mansion in the mangrove was eventually demolished by court order. It was a place of too much suffering to continue existing. But before it was destroyed, it briefly became a place of pilgrimage. People came from afar to see where Benedict had been held, to understand the magnitude of the horror and survival. A small wooden cross was erected on the site with a simple plaque, "In memory of human suffering and the resilience of the spirit. May we never forget." Sebastian's execution took place on a cold winter morning. Helen was invited to attend, but respectfully declined. "I've seen enough evil for a lifetime," she explained to the judge. "I don't need to see any more. May God judge his soul now." Benedict also did not go, for the same reason. Justice had been served. The monster would be removed from the world, but they chose to focus on the future instead of dwelling on the past. Years later, when Helen was already a respected elder in the community, she often received visits from people seeking advice or simply wanting to hear the story directly from her. She always welcomed them with hospitality, telling the story honestly but without excessive dramatization. "I did what needed to be done," she always said. "Anyone in my position would have done the same. I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother who protected her children and had compassion for someone suffering. That should be normal, not exceptional." But for those who heard the complete story, who understood the courage required at that moment in the old mansion when all seemed lost, Helen was indeed a hero. She was a symbol that even in the most desperate situations, human kindness and courage can prevail. Benedict lived many more years, always grateful for every day of freedom. He never married or had children of his own, but he considered Helen's family his own. He was an honorary uncle to the children, present at every celebration, every important milestone. In old age, his story became a local legend. Teachers used it as an example of resilience. Priests cited it in sermons about faith and perseverance. And always, always, Helen was mentioned as the savior, the woman who chose compassion when most would have chosen only their own survival. When Helen finally passed away at an advanced age, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the entire village attended the funeral. Benedict, quite elderly himself, insisted on giving the eulogy. With a voice trembling with age but firm in conviction, he recounted once more the story of the old mansion in the mangrove. "This extraordinary woman," he said, "taught me that true strength doesn't come from muscles or weapons. It comes from the heart. It comes from refusing to accept injustice. It comes from protecting the defenseless, even when you yourself are defenseless. Helen saved me on that terrible day, but her lesson saved my soul forever." And so the story of Helen, Peter, Rose, Benedict, and the cursed old mansion in the mangrove passed from generation to generation. The details might have changed a little over time, as happens with all stories, but the core remained intact, a powerful reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single light of courage and compassion can change everything. That evil, however powerful it may seem, eventually falls before truth and justice, and that we should never underestimate the power of an ordinary person doing the right thing, even when it's the hardest thing. The mangrove still exists, of course. Nature remains indifferent to human dramas. But where the old mansion once stood, now there is only vegetation reclaiming its territory. And at that simple wooden cross, periodically replaced when it rots, people still leave flowers. Not for Sebastian or the horrors that happened there, but as a tribute to Helen, to Benedict, to all who suffer unjustly, and to all who have the courage to fight against it. It is a silent but powerful reminder that our humanity is tested not in easy moments, but in impossible ones, and that in those moments, the choice we make defines who we truly are. We have reached the end of this incredible and disturbing story that shows us how much courage and compassion can change destinies. If this narrative touched you in any way, if you felt every moment of tension and were moved by Helen's strength, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the next stories we'll share here. And I really want to hear from you. What did this story teach you? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between your own safety and doing what was right? Share your experience or your reflections on this powerful narrative in the comments below. This community grows and strengthens when we all share our stories and learnings with each other. You never know who might need to hear exactly what you have to say today. Until the next video, and always remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of it. See you soon.